impasse, not to mention the enormous expectations at home and abroad that in the light of the SADC report in particular, but also the other observer reports, that something would be done by SADC. Not necessarily in the form of boots on the ground, because I don't think that is the solution in our region, but in the form of some kind of diplomacy, quiet diplomacy, to use the old term to reference South Africa, but at least some kind of prodding towards maybe the 2008 situation in as former President Mbeki indicated in his own view after the election impasse. But there's been enormous expectations just moving around in the region. Everyone, especially Zimbabwe, they're saying, when is SADC taking a position? What is SADC going to do? Some of it are very exaggerated. They think that SADC might invade and put things in place. Others, like most of us, really hope that in South Africa in particular, can use its hegemonic position in the region to prod Mnangagwa and his team towards some kind of accommodation. Then, of course, the opposition, the CCC, or whatever left of it, the position remains the same, that the election was flawed. Initially, they wanted a rerun of the election. They seem to have changed their position now. They seem to accept more or less that the horses have bolted, and perhaps move to the Plan B, transitional authority, during which there will be a reform agenda before the next election. For many of us, and hence the reason for this topic, is to see whether it's not too late, notwithstanding the speed with which Mnangagwa has moved to put a cabinet in place, has literally played the card that the elections are done and dusted. Is to say, no, things are not as rosy as they should be. The impasse imposes an enormous burden, particularly with respect to the continued wrangling in the country, not to mention the abductions of opposition members, the recalls of virtually most of, if not all, the CCC MPs, a situation which smacks of a return to one-party state. But all indication that all is not well. And of course, on the economic front, the expectations that the debt arrears will be seen to, that there'll be re-engagement with the rest of the world, and of course, end to sanctions, and readmission into the Commonwealth. These appear to be in abeyance, on hold, pending some kind of settlement. So, some of us, the platform of concerned citizens, we put across a petition, soon after the election. We have since produced a document towards a comprehensive political and economic settlement in Zimbabwe, for which we are hoping that the various parties at home and abroad can consider, and we have shared the document with SADC and South Africa in particular. So that is, in a way, a summary of a very topical subject, a political impasse that has followed the election. So I'll ask Walter Mzembe to come in, give his outline, followed by Maurice Mbeki, and then Larry Gaba, and last but not least, Gilbert Mtebuga. Welcome, Walter.
Thank you, Dr. Mandaza. Thank you for organizing this futuristic session on Zimbabwe going forward post-elections 2023. I make the case here on why a comprehensive, inclusive national dialogue on the perennial Zimbabwe question will ultimately be the solution, whatever stalemate causes it. But it will be the solution. But like any solution, it should start with an accurate diagnosis of the problem. It is my submission that currently the country is being run through counterintelligence narratives as opposed to the dictates of statecraft and principles. And until we outside government, the opposition and civil society start operating at a higher level than this, united in purpose, and abandon our current silos approach, we will be in this wilderness for a very long, long time. Just like the children of Israel, we are currently all over the place. We are responding to contrived scripts that give us all sorts of scenarios, and this informs some of our cryptic responses to the Zimbabwean crisis. So typically a journey that would have lasted 40 days for the Israelis in their exodus eventually lasted 40 years because they were responding to different narratives until they recalibrated to principles, the Mosaic 10 Commandments, and years later they were ushered into the Promised Land. So I submit first that our struggle has suffered setbacks on the lack of standing on principle, and I will demonstrate why. Secondly, we depart from where I come from, particularly ourselves, the exiles, and differ with Harare on the principle of the desecration of our constitution, predicated by the November 2017 coup. This event was so significant to the extent that it ultimately altered the course and political culture of our country going forward. Number four, it's impossible, as has already been stated here and elsewhere, that you cannot build a new Zimbabwe on a false foundation without acknowledging the far-reaching consequences and implications of the coup on our founding values and ethos as a nation. My fifth submission speaks to something that we have highlighted in the last election, that no past, present, and future election will cure a coup. Neither can any court verdict or ruling cleanse a coup. In the extreme of cases, a coup is cured by a coup. But if we don't exercise restraint amongst ourselves and then begin to direct ourselves towards the ultimate solution of a comprehensive, inclusive national dialogue, we may play ourselves victim to other devices. So November 2017 was a culmination of other coups in varying degrees that our nation may not have understood at the time. And it begins with the legendary, infamous statement by the then commander of the Defense Forces, Vitalis Zvinavashi, in 2002, when he uttered the statement that the office of the president was a straitjacket only to be occupied by a certain pedigree of aspirants with liberation war credentials. Only people with those credentials would assume the office of presidency, according to that constituency. So moving on to 2005, 2008, the ritual of disputed elections kicked off, and 2008 is particularly a case in point. I was in the engine room of the ZANU-PF runoff committee for President Mugabe at the time. He had conscripted me in a group of 15 cadres to champion his June 27 runoff, but we never got to do things the civil way, because 4 weeks down the line, we were unceremoniously disbanded for a hardline response which saw Morgan Tsvangirai fleeing the country for Botswana, over 200 lives lost, many injured and displaced in a paramilitary onslaught in which Mugabe proceeded to the runoff alone. The architects of this solution, and I want to emphasize that, are in power today. President Mbeki came on the scene, brokered the solution that became the GPA and GNU as we know it today. So in 2008, there was a backroom coup, only that it was benefiting Mugabe and the succession designs of the team that is now in power. If you go back to the 2002 SADC Observer Mission report, it reads like just the August 2023 report by Nevas Mumba. The same SADC in November 2017 asked me when I was Minister of Foreign Affairs to present to foreign ministers in the region, in the SADC region, a solution that would avert a coup just 2 or 3 days before the coup actually blew and exploded. And I presented to the SADC foreign ministers a solution that basically was calling Mnangagwa back from self-imposed exile in South Africa, reassigning him back to his 2 portfolios in the party and government as vice president in both instances, and allowing him to test his popularity at a Congress that was ensuing in December 2017. The solution would also set aside the ongoing impeachment motion that was taking place and allow a constitutional handover, takeover both at party in December 2017 and government in June 2018. Mugabe would then be retired together with his wife and some elements identified then as toxic as part of the solution. SADC had started curing the coup. They didn't want it. They didn't want it to happen. Unfortunately, parallel to SADC processes, Mugabe succumbed to the impeachment process with the fatal decision to hand in a written resignation before heads of state led by President Lourenço of Angola, the same Lourenço who was presiding over this last extraordinary summit, would fly down to present the adopted solution. So there was a mistiming of just about 15 minutes, during which period my then permanent secretary for foreign affairs, Joey Bima, could not guarantee landing and safety rights for the SADC team. And this is what caused that misalignment. It was all part of the conspiracy, and we were not aware that even our bureaucrats had been conscripted into this unconstitutionality. But what is also interesting is the pushback by the opposition and civil society at the time for SADC to back off and allow this November unconstitutionality to prevail. So it was the most unprincipled stance ever adopted by those fighting for democracy and constitutionalism. So today, the very same constituents goes back again to SADC and say, come and help us and do this thing, when at that time they were the ones actually chasing SADC away. These contradictions, and this is why I emphasize the keyword, the principle, these contradictions haunt us to this day. This background, Professor Ibo Mandaza, is very important knowledge for any solution for the recurrent stalemate going forward, in that without acknowledging that the expedience of wanting to see Mugabe's back at the time, including that of the international community also, let alone from our own opposition, gave the coup credibility and got it endorsed, with some describing it at the time as a coup which was not a coup. There was so much goodwill going for the new administration at the time, which was lost through the window. An opportunity to cure the coup then by inviting and leading Zimbabweans to a reset through a comprehensive, inclusive national dialogue was lost, and Congress politics were set in motion to this day. And that's what we're dealing with. Missing a fresh opportunity to unite Zimbabweans for purpose and unleashing the country with all its diversity on a new trajectory of nation building and developmental politics characterized by reforms and restoration of our state to its legacy founding values and ethos. So my point 10 basically speaks to Project Reset to constitutionalism going forward. Evidently, because of the coup, all the 3 pillars of the state, the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive, are operating as one. The military has been the elephant in the room, but this also is changing with time, with a complete reconfiguration of the players of November 2017, scores of deaths, retirements, and reassignments in a power consolidation exercise that has relegated those who used to call themselves stockholders, maybe to stakeholders, and if what happened recently, it succeeded to a partisan military element that is subjugated to ZANU-PF. So we have to, we have a limited window to probably plead with a few remnants of the 2017 military command element to recalibrate things as originally envisioned. In November 2017, they still commanded the cloud. That cloud is gone. There's a lot of isolation of that military element. And if we are obviously not careful, this command element may actually turn out to be a family command element. And with it, it will subject itself to the whims of the party and those that are seeking to rule indefinitely. We are where we were at the beginning of the Lancaster House Conference in 1979, which predicated credible, free and fair elections in 1980 to the satisfaction of all. And comparatively, we are where we were in 2008 after Mugabe sailed home alone. So this is our political location in contemporary terms. What is interesting is that we've always eventually resolved our stalemates, which is my point 11, around the conference table by negotiation. Lancaster itself being testimony, the Unitary Code of 1987 ending a very sad chapter in our history in Matabeleland, the rejected year 2000 Constitution, another attempted dialogue, 2008 Global Political Agreement and GNU, and resultant 2013 Constitution. All these things speak to how culturally we resolve our disputes when we have a stalemate or conflict within us and amongst us. The big question, reflecting on November 2017, therefore, would be, which processes cured the November 2017 coup, evidently such a gross violation of our founding values and ethos? The military coup of 2017 rolled back the gains achieved at Lancaster, rolled back the gains of the Unitary Code of 1987, rolled back the gains of the GPA, a major outstanding feature of this having been the security cluster reforms that we thought were going to be done at the time, and an element that haunts us to this day. With the present latest attempt of conscripting a serving commander of the defense forces into the Politburo of ZANU-PF being testimony. Which country in SADC, and this is the question we should ask SADC all the time, would follow such an example and get away with it? Why is it only good for Zimbabweans to build their future on conquest politics? So in the absence of national conversation that resets us to constitutionalism, it is evident that courts and elections cannot fix this thing. It's time for us to come forward, statesmen to come forward, including the clergy. I'm particularly very incensed by the clergy because they played a role to soften the coup at the time, and they continue marinating a growing dictatorship to do. I'm calling for them to do the responsible thing, to stand out, step forward, and begin to heal and help in the healing of the nation. It's time for those that endorse the coup to take responsibility and help in finding a lasting cure to this case. We are more polarized now in the country than we were under Mugabe, so the excuse to restore our legacy becomes a monumental deception. The legacy of Lancaster, of self-determination, one man, one vote, has been severely compromised by these infamous recalls that we're experiencing. The legacy of unity derived from the Unitary Code and the GPA has also been tossed away. Let me, in concluding, state that myself and others in exile, those that I speak on their behalf, Square and others, we remain committed to the principles of the liberation struggle and our founding values and ethos as a nation. But in pronouncing a reset, it is precisely to put this derailed revolution back on track. So what I see going forward is a Lancaster House Conference 2.0, a comprehensive, inclusive national dialogue solution with everyone in the room, including the military, who should be engaged as stakeholders on the aspirations of a new Zimbabwe by its people. This cannot be communicated to them by a divisive process such as elections, because elections by their nature are very divisive, let alone ritually disputed ones that virtually all observers have condemned. Neither can this be settled by the adjudication of our courts, because it achieves exactly the opposite of uniting a society. The military recently demonstrated principle by refusing to subordinate itself under ZANU-PF through the irregular and illegal conscription of a commander of the defense forces to its Politburo. So they know what is right. They know what should be done. We need more of that professionalism and comprehension of statecraft and separation of roles and power and pillars. What is missing, Professor Ibo Mandaza? What is missing is a nationally ordained framework of engagement. So let the statesmen emerge and pursue dialogue, notwithstanding how long it takes. Longest negotiations took 1.5 years. Delaying the start is delaying the solution. Who haggle, who fight, who dismiss each other along the way, a painful but inevitable process which needs commitment in sustaining our grievances and making sure that they are not victim to struggle, fatigue, or half-baked solutions which evidently manifest as fresh wounds with each election cycle. So if we agree on the principle of comprehensive, inclusive national dialogue, and I'm happy you outlined that in your preamble, let's all be party to that. Let's all be party to that. No matter how long it takes, the how can be the next stage, but it is the process that requires skills and dedication. But if we agree on national, inclusive, comprehensive dialogue as a solution, I think it's a good beginning. I submit. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much for this, Walter Mzembe, former Minister of Foreign Affairs before the coup in 2017, and now in exile somewhere in Southern Africa, but obviously engaged with the home situation daily on Twitter, and we're happy to have had him today. Walter, I've just a few questions before I move on to Molet. The first is the capacity of SADC to assist the process. You made reference in what is a very revealing detail, which many people didn't know about, the attempt by SADC in November 2017 to cure the coup. What do you think were what could SADC have done, given that Lourenço and Zuma were refused or denied safe access to Zimbabwe, safe landing rights?
Without Mugabe's capitulation, which was read in Parliament that he had resigned, they were coming notwithstanding. They were coming to invalidate everything that had taken place, including his own firing of his own deputy, his self-exiling. So there was going to be an element of restitution on his behalf, and they were also going to invalidate the impeachment processes and do a reset. So the problem actually became the resignation letter, which was read in Parliament, because while we were pursuing the SADC resolution, there were other people bearing pressure on Mugabe inside his residence there. And the letter turned out to be Father Mkonori and Tim, who bore pressure on him, including the late President Kaunda. Because I recall my last telephone conversation with Mugabe, It was Kenneth Kaunda on the phone, and they were all basically persuading him to step down, but they were oblivious of the processes that were taking place on a parallel trajectory inside SADC. I could not come out in the open to present anything to the nation because I was also under siege myself at the time. So I was conducting this actually from the safety of a lodge in Harare, and I couldn't come out. So it was all virtual coordination, having everything passed at every stage, virtually through Dr. Tex at SADC. So the resignation
that basically
was problematic.
Would you agree that the architects of the coup were not in favor of SADC mediation, obviously?
They were not in favor. They even dispatched lots of lobbyists to stop SADC from stepping in. But the fatal blow actually came from those that had been victims of the regime for a long time, which was the opposition civil society, coming out to say, no, SADC, we actually don't want you here. We'll fix our own issues. Yeah.
Yes. Now,
so they disempowered and disabled SADC.
But you have been following obviously the process since the SADC report, the SEOM, and the meeting of the Troika, the meeting of the summit on the 4th of November. What is your understanding as to what SADC might still do to mediate a solution in Zimbabwe?
I'm very pessimistic. I'm very pessimistic at this stage about a SADC solution because the conditions obtaining at home do not suggest a country that is in conflict to that extent. So SADC only steps in when peace, security, stability is evidently undermined.
Blood on the floor.
Yeah. And there's no evidence of that. Parliamentary democracy is functioning almost very well. The recalls are being respected by those that are supposed to be crying foul. In fact, they are going through now to validate those recalls by participating in the 9 December elections. So there's lots of contradictions, and this is why I speak about principles. If you decide not to be party to something because you say it's flawed or it's unconstitutional, you must go all the way. You cannot say, no, I want to have a victory because I've got 104 seats. So we want a president because these are gains we cannot throw away. There are times when you actually have to throw away what little victory you have in order to stand on principle and get the ultimate solution.
But
so
then,
we are undermining ourselves.
Having said that, Walter, would you agree that therefore the chances for the kind of conference you are recommending, indeed the kind of conference all of us are recommending, is very slim? And who would convene the conference?
We would have to. I think we have to emerge from within the country. The one thing that I see that miffs Harare a lot is actually getting the intrusion of SADC into these processes. So I think we should start motivating a whole school of statesmen inside the country who bear pressure or at least reach out for the kind of comprehensive national and inclusive dialogue that we are envisioning. I see very little collaboration coming from SADC because there's a piggybacking of favors. There are countries going for elections now under Zimbabwean chairmanship very soon, whom you would expect right now to be intrinsically interested in the affairs of Zimbabwe, but they've taken almost an impassive position because they also have elections in the future. So the SADC Troika organ, as it migrates from one country to another, is a very powerful organ to endorse club aspirations inside the region. And some countries know how to use it very effectively.
I'll come back to you on the national dialogue and a kind of Lancaster House type conference, and maybe at the end you may want to give some thought and recommend how we can begin that process Some of us have begun that, but it's going very slow. Maybe how we can put an impact and impetus to the process of resolving this impasse. Thanks, Walter. Thanks very much. And now move to Moletsi Mbeki. Moletsi, please welcome.
Thank you, Ibo, and good afternoon to everybody. Well, I'm one of the few people in South Africa and in the ANC who was a supporter of ZANU. And I'm going way back to the split between ZANU and ZAPU. So I have, amongst the South Africans, I have the advantage of having been a ZANU supporter, which is why Ibo has been my friend for many years. And Nathan Shamyarira was a friend. Rex Nongo was a friend. And why I ended up in Zimbabwe in the 1980s was because of my closeness to ZANU. So I know a little bit more about ZANU than the average South African. I supported ZANU because of what I perceive to be its radicalism and its militancy and its willingness to take on the white settler regime and fight it out. So that was what attracted me to ZANU. What I didn't know was the brutality inside ZANU. But because I was a supporter of ZANU, I kept track of what was going on in ZANU. So after the assassination of Herbert Chitepo, I think I was the only South African, or in the ANC anyway, or who read the OAU report on why Herbert Chitepo was assassinated and what were the circumstances. This was in the 1970s. Walter has talked about the achievements at Lancaster House, which we all thought was the achievement of constitutionalism in Zimbabwe. In 1979, with the Lancaster House Agreement, followed by an election, we thought this was the beginning of constitutionalism in Zimbabwe. Well, we were all wrong. Very soon after the elections in Zimbabwe was the massacre of the Zipra militants at Ntumbani barracks. I notice we're all talking about Emerson Mnangagwa and those guys. I haven't heard a word about the 5th Brigade. But even before the 5th Brigade, the Rhodesia Light Infantry and ZANU and ZANLA operated together to slaughter the militants of Zipra at Ntumbani barracks. Ibo knows very well what happened at Ntumbani barracks. So it is a myth that Zimbabwe has been a constitutional government. Since the massacre at Ntumbani barracks, Zimbabwe has been a dictatorship in one form or another. And I can go on through what happened in Matabeleland, and I can go on through the murder of Rex Nongo or Solomon Mujuru, the imprisonment of the leadership, the former leadership of Lookout Masuku and Dabengwa and whatever. I was actually one of the court reporters in the case of Lookout and Dabengwa. So, has there been democracy in Zimbabwe? The answer is no. Maybe there was for a few months, but from the slaughter of Ntumbani barracks, there has been no democracy in Zimbabwe. The mistake that all of us have made was to assume there was democracy. And instead of just seeing this as a front or for what the elite in ZANU-PF wanted to do. Anyway, I won't go further into that topic. Let me come back to two most important issues, which again, we are not discussing in the context of Zimbabwe. First, the issue of SADC. SADC was not created by the Africans. This is one of the things that we in Southern Africa, or we in Africa, either we don't know our history or we choose not to know our history. When the common market for Africa was conceived in the Lagos Plan of Action, there was no SADC. What was there in the regional structure, it was Southeastern and Southern Africa, which is COMESA. That's what the Lagos Plan of Action designed. It did not design SADC. SADC was carved out of Eastern and Southern Africa, the common market of Eastern and Southern Africa, by the Western countries, working together with Siresa Khama. They created SADC. So that's point number one, which is very important to understand who SADC is, whose interest it serves, why does it exist? Why is South Africa not a member of COMESA? South Africa, by the way, the ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, were full members during the liberation struggles. They were full members of COMESA. Oliver Tambo sat as the head of state in the councils of COMESA. But the minute apartheid ended, the ANC pulled out of COMESA and refused to participate in COMESA and only joined SADC. I was part of the ANC conference where we debated the issue of what South Africa should do in connection with the difference between SADC and COMESA. And the resolution, we had a big fight there with the COMESA only faction, which was led by Trevor Manuel and some, I'm trying to remember the names now. But anyway, we won that South Africa should join both COMESA and SADC. The recommendation that went to the National Executive Committee was exactly the opposite, that South Africa should only join SADC. And I was so shocked that I even phoned my brother, which I don't normally do, to say you are being told a lie by what was decided. The meeting was held at the University of the Western Cape. And Rob Davis was the convener of the meeting, him and Trevor Manuel. And they lied to the ANC National Executive Committee and said that we had decided that South Africa must join SADC only and not COMESA. So that is the second point I want to make. The third point is to do with the role of the Southern Africa region in the world. A few years ago, I attended a huge conference in Beijing, organized by the Chinese parliament. There were over 1,000 delegations. And this was a conference to discuss the use of the world's natural resources, whether this is not going to lead to a development crisis for the world with the depletion of the world's natural resources. One of the presenters at that conference was the chief geologist of China. And the chief geologist of China explained at that conference that they had done a survey of the mineral deposits in the world which China needed for its development. They did a survey of the whole world, of Australia, of the Indian subcontinent, of Siberia, of North America, of South America, and they came to the conclusion that the most important deposits for the development of China are in Southern Africa. Now, China is not the only one who came to that conclusion. The Americans came to the conclusion. I think we all remember Henry Kissinger, who died yesterday with his national security memorandum in the 1960s. We all know the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of the United States Congress. It exempted the minerals from sanctions. Now, why is this important? This is important because for me, the lessons I have learned about the crisis in Zimbabwe is that the crisis in our individual countries cannot just be solved by the individual countries. It's very clear the Zimbabweans have done, really, the opposition has done a sterling job since 1999, since the formation of MDC in 1999. They have done an incredible job in opposing the dictatorship, and they've lost. And why do they lose? Because they thought they could fight the dictatorship in Zimbabwe on their own, not as part of a regional struggle. During Morgan Tsvangirai's leadership of MDC, we in South Africa, in COSATU, and in civil society, we put it to Morgan. And we said to him, Morgan, do you want us to blockade Zimbabwe? We, the trade unions and the civil society, to bring that regime to its knees. The problems of Zimbabwe, of course, have been solved by Zimbabwean people, but they have also been solved by the region. When the Portuguese Empire fell, it was South African apartheid regime which realized that the Zimbabwean problem had to be solved. So they insisted to Ian Smith that he must release Joshua Nkomo and that he must release Robert Mugabe to start the negotiations for a settlement, because South Africa didn't want to fight a war on all its borders. It didn't want to fight a war in Angola, a war in Zimbabwe, a war in Mozambique. It knew it had to fight a war, but it didn't want to fight a war along this 4,000-kilometer border. So they insisted that Smith had to release Nkomo and Mugabe. And that was Foster, one of the apartheid regime's presidents. So that is how the first, and when Smith could not and was against the settlement at Lancaster House, he was threatened by South Africa. And Zimbabwe is a landlocked country and is hugely dependent on South Africa economically. Zimbabwe is dependent on South Africa and Mozambique. If you close down the border of South Africa and Zimbabwe and Mozambique to Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe will crash within a week. So that is precisely one of the reasons why SADC was set up, so that what didn't happen. So to try and conclude, Ibo, I hear what Walter is saying about the dialogue, and it's not for me to say what the Zimbabweans have to do. However, there has to be, if we are going to solve not just the Zimbabwe crisis, there's a mega crisis in Mozambique. not just of the Islamists, but of rigged local government elections in Maputo and so on and so forth. So for us, those of us who are opposed to dictatorship in Southern Africa, we have to form a united front within the region. And with all due respect to Walter, they have been party to the dictatorship of Robert Mugabe. And I don't see how he can honestly tell me that he wants democracy in Zimbabwe. He was part of the Mugabe dictatorship. Okay, they fell out amongst themselves. The G40 and Emerson and Robert fell out amongst themselves. Well, I mean, it's part of the territory, but I don't see the G40 as part of the solution to the Zimbabwe problem or to the problems of Southern Africa. I think I'll end there, Ibo. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Molethi, for that historical background. Obviously, you have very little faith in SADC, then and now. And therefore, should I even bother to ask you whether you see any follow-up in terms of the SEOM report and through SIAC? You were there when I gave that lecture at the oral school. It's more than a month since. Do you see any traction in terms of the possible mediation by SADC?
And I see South Africa blocking, even if SADC, even if Zambia, for example, and I have my question mark about, even if they wanted to go forward with the democratic movement in Zimbabwe and put pressure on the Mnangagwa regime, South Africa will oppose them.
Why? Why would they?
South Africa, the ANC government is itself threatened to lose power in the next coming election. All the opinion polls show that the ANC will not get a majority. And one of the biggest fear of the ANC was civil society setting up a political party to oppose existing liberation party governments. And that's one of the reasons that the ANC never supported MDC to win on its own in Zimbabwe. It always backed the Mugabe regime.
But are you saying,
I think we all know how it did.
Wouldn't you agree that there's discord within the ANC over the years, over the Zimbabwe question? I noticed that myself in the manner in which my lecture dates were banded around. I'm aware of the fact that people like Molethi Mbeki and many others would want to see some kind of traction in the Zimbabwe situation. Would you say the ANC is coherent, unanimous in its position on Zimbabwe? Or do you see cleavages? Do you see differences which the progressive force could exploit in South Africa?
I think the leadership is one on what to do about Zimbabwe, which is to keep the Mnangagwa regime in power. They may want to co-opt sections of civil society or the opposition, like they happened in 2008. But essentially, they want the Mnangagwa regime to stay there.
As part of the solidarity among liberation movements, whose credentials are at a low at the moment, all around the region?
Yes, but the solidarity movement of liberation governments of ANC, Frelimo, SWAPO, ZANU, who am I leaving out? MPLA. That's where the real the functioning solidarity is in Southern Africa. We, as the opposition in Southern Africa, allowed our very strong civil society organizations, like the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, like the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSAT, to flounder and collapse and become weakened. But the coalition of the ruling elite is absolutely intact.
Thanks, Olesi. Consistent. Thanks. Let me move now to Larry Gaba. Larry, much of the conversation so far might be very marginal to the kind of stuff we want to talk about. But we are interested to know what is the establishment's view on the post-election situation in Zimbabwe, on the question of legitimacy, on the question of the SADC report, and indeed other reports, including the AU. And I wanted to add also, I don't know if you're aware, that the ANC sent an observer mission to Harare, many of the individual countries. These reports have not been published, but we have reliable information that most, if not all, registered an adverse report on the election. Anyway, Larry, I don't want to preempt your presentation. Larry.
Thanks, Ibu, and appreciate being invited to participate in this discussion and to share some impressions, including following up from some of the questions, Ibu, that you just raised. Let me start with just a bit of a follow-up to something Dr. Mbeki said, related to the fact that we are marking the death of Henry Kissinger today, and clearly he had a very mixed reputation in terms of his dealings in Southern Africa, including with Zimbabwe. And the one point that I'd raise related to the conversation related to sort of the area of expertise that I have on election observation is that my sense is that if Kissinger had been in power, or Ford had won the election in 1976, and Kissinger had remained as Secretary of State, then the internal elections that occurred in 1979 that were organized by the Ian Smith regime would have been treated as legitimate and would have resulted in the recognition of that government. But instead, there was criticism by some observers of that election for good reason. And the result in the US, at least, was that the elections were not accepted. And the next steps were the Lancaster House negotiations, which led to elections under Commonwealth observation. And in this case, or in the case of 1980 Zimbabwe, I think the Commonwealth did a quite commendable job. And indeed, from my perspective, when I was working on this initially back in the early 1980s, provided the model for what international election observing could do. And so it's been a, sort of an irony in many respects that, although Zimbabwe sort of emerged as a result of election observers both being critical of the 1979 elections and then being quite supportive of the 1980 elections, Zimbabwe as a country has, generally been hostile to international observation, with maybe the exception of the 2018 elections. In terms of the question that you asked, Ibu, about SADC and the SEOM, frankly, I think many of us, both in terms of the international observer community as well as the Zimbabwe government, were surprised both by the immediate statements that were made after the election and by the report that was issued, by the SEOM. I think the Zimbabwe government's calculations were that they could try to marginalize the European Union, the Carter Center, throughout the process, denying early access to being present. I was in Zimbabwe in July 2022, a year before, trying to set up an operation, and was asked to leave the country, and when the Carter Center eventually was authorized to send observers, I was denied permission to enter Zimbabwe. And again, I think this was part of a calculated effort by the government to minimize the role that Carter Center and the European Union would be able to play in critiquing the process and in having much influence. And yet what happened was, I think, quite surprising to the government and quite surprising, frankly, to many of those who've watched the SADC observers, is that they, were basically right in line with what the other, what we call Western observer groups were saying and criticizing the process. And, one could ask why. I think a combination of a few reasons. There has been a professionalization and institutionalization of, the basic rules governing election observation that has impacted on SADC and certainly at the technical level. I think the person who led the delegation for the SEOM was, someone who was able to call it straight. And I think having other observers there, like the EU and Carter Center and others, created a sort of herd mentality where SADC was encouraged to adopt the same basic conclusion that the other observer groups had done. And in terms of, the final report, I mean, again, if you go through it, it is, quite clear that on all the details, the government just didn't meet, as it says, the constitutional requirements, the election law requirements, or the SADC standards. And it sort of tones it down a bit at the end, but the implications are very clear. And again, you can contrast their final report with the European Union final report, which came out a couple of weeks ago, which is very blunt in terms of, stating, basically in the opening paragraph, that the elections were marked by a curtailment of rights and freedoms and the lack of a level playing field. So from the outset, the European Union is discounting the credibility of the elections, whereas in the SEOM report, it's a little bit more subtle, but it's there. And so that raises the question of, where do you go from SEOM to SADC, and how much influence does the fact that, the SADC team was critical influence the broader international community? On the first question, I'm not enough of an expert on SADC to comment on it, although, what I have seen is certainly there has been a considerable ambivalence in the, and perhaps that's putting it mildly, in the response of SADC to the report that was prepared by its own team, and hesitant about taking specific political actions that you and others have called for from the countries in the region. So it's a good thing that the technical team did its job and reported on the elections. Translating that into political action, requires some other efforts, and I'm not going to guess as to whether they'll take place now or in the soon future. I will say though that having the SADC or the SEOM report has, I think, really reinforced in Western countries, including the United States, an unwillingness to accept the Zimbabwe elections other than what they are, which was significantly flawed and leading to a situation that is deteriorating by the day. The last comment I'll make is that although that is all true, Zimbabwe just doesn't rate pretty high on the policy agenda of the United States. There just isn't enough oxygen in the room given developments in Ukraine and Russia, Israel and Gaza, and just the more general preoccupation with relationships with China. Now, that is sort of the back door where Zimbabwe, resonates with U.S. policymakers, the competition, in different countries, including Zimbabwe, about Chinese influence. But I'm not sure it's enough to make it, where there's an expectation that the United States will do anything more than it has been doing until now, which is, to maintain the sanctions and to, call out Zimbabwe, for abuses of human rights and for other actions that are seen as significantly problematic. So there's more I can say about both SEOM and the international observation, but I don't want to take up more time now, but I'm happy to answer questions regarding those two topics also.
Larry, why is the US in particular, but likewise even the European Union countries, especially on the back of their own report, which was quite adverse, and the UK, in which hearing those who went to the reception to welcome the new British ambassador, they appear to be either in indifference to the developments or the happenings in Zimbabwe. And one might say on the part of the British, at least from the outpourings of the new ambassador, that even re-engagement is in the process, notwithstanding this backdrop we have described. Would that be the same for the US? Unless the US is too engaged with the Ukraine and now the Gaza-Israel conflict. What is the position with regard to countries which have been very explicit about their condemnation of the happenings in Zimbabwe, including the election, and yet now appears lukewarm? If there was not the very little or no drama at all with the EU report, what do you say? What's your reflection on that?
So, I mean, I'm not there. I haven't met the British ambassador, and even on the United States side, I'm speaking more in a speculative matter. But I do think that when new ambassadors arrive in country, they think of themselves as they're going to be the savior. They're going to be the ones that are going to be able to engage with the relevant parties and bring them together. And forget that there's 20, 30 years of history where their predecessors tried to do the exact same thing and basically failed. So and in a sense, that's why you want to have a rotation of ambassadors, because you want someone who's going to have some new enthusiasm where there is none in the capitals. I mean, like I said, I don't think this is probably 11 on a list of 10 of the Secretary of State's priorities at this point of what's happening in Zimbabwe. So having a new ambassador, whether from the UK or from the US or elsewhere, is a good thing in that sense, and that it creates some effort to engage. But the effort to engage to someone who's sitting in Zimbabwe looks like basically you're engaging with the government that has been there in power and has just conducted these quite flawed elections, and you're looking how to, or you're inevitably being perceived as having trying to legitimize them, or trying to convince your capital that perhaps they're not as bad as you thought. And then reality takes over, and as you sit there and see the reports of whether it's people being detained or MPs being kicked out of their office or the like, you begin to say, wait a minute, maybe the reports I received before I got here were true in some respects, and I need to have a different approach. So I'm not surprised that you get that sense from a new ambassador, but I think it's important that the new ambassadors go out and listen not just to their government contacts, but to others in the society. And here I think and I'll just mention this as a last point, Ivo. I think the opportunity, the one bright star in the in the Zimbabwe context today is whether the mayors of the large cities can demonstrate that they are really trying to address some of the crucial issues of corruption, of services, and the like, and really can provide an alternative model for not only for internal purposes, which is obviously critical given the size of those cities, but also as a point of, hey, we shouldn't give up on Zimbabwe because there are individuals and institutions that we can work with to help make for a better life for Zimbabweans.
Yeah, Larry, I'll come back to you because the big question is whether there's really an impasse or it's a fait accompli. When you hear some of the statements by the external factors, it's almost as if it's a fait accompli. And then that's one of the reasons why we're having the discussion, that there's still rocky storms ahead, and we need to preempt those if possible. Thanks, Larry. We'll come back to you later.
Sure.
Let's go now to Gilbert Mutebuga. You came in late, but you came in as Olesi was making his presentation. And of course, you've heard Larry's presentation. You missed Walter Mzembe's, which is quite revealing. For example, one of the points he made, I don't know if you're aware of it, that in 3 days before Mugabe, or just about the time, on the day that Mugabe submitted his letter of resignation under pressure, the SADC leaders, Lourenco and Zuma, were going to arrive in Harare, invalidate the coup, or rather reverse the coup, have Mnangagwa reinstated as vice president, and encourage a constitutional process within ZANU towards the election of the new leader, if any, at the Congress, which was due 2 weeks out thereafter. Apart from that, he was very strong on the need for a national dialogue and a conference which would restore constitutionalism in Zimbabwe, heal the wounds, and cure the coup. So basically, that was Walter's presentation. I want to add here to everybody listening that we are on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and this is, of course, recorded. You get your YouTube recorded tomorrow. So we have a record of the discussion. So, Gilbert, welcome. Gilbert.
Prof, I'm sure you wanted to say Brighton. I'm sure you wanted to say Brighton there.
What did I say?
Gilbert.
Brighton, sorry.
There's a Gilbert somewhere lurking in the shadows, is there?
Hope you won't prosecute me for that.
No chance at all. No chance at all.
Okay. Welcome,
thank you very much. Thank you for having me, Prof. I apologize for getting in late. I think I had a court date today, like I said, so there was a clash there in terms of commitments. But nevertheless, this is it's an honor, and I'm truly humbled to address such an audience on a matter of such crucial importance to our nation. I've taken on board what you've said pertaining to my dear brother, Walter Mzembe, the former Zim foreign minister. And I mean, what I would say is that clearly we are at a crossroads. This is a poignant moment in our history. And I think it's highly significant that we are engaging at this moment in time in November of 2023, November being the month that Robert Mugabe dramatically fell from power. The reason why I mention that is that, in my view, the fall from power of Robert Mugabe sends a powerful lesson to all totalitarians and autocrats, that power is fleeting by nature. Now, you've highlighted the fact that Mr. Mzembe did say that there were last-ditch attempts by SADC to rope in the former South African President Jacob Zuma, and also, I think you did say Lourenço, His Excellency President Lourenço of Angola, to come in and try and reverse the coup. What I would highlight there is that this was too little, too late, and that is the lesson. And essentially, the key is this: when you are in power, when these people are in power, they never contemplate losing power. They see at the core of their ideology, negotiations or coming to a political settlement with the opposition as a weakness. So if we are to have progress throughout SADC, including in Zimbabwe, there has to be a fundamental shift in thinking within the regime itself, especially ruling parties and these so-called liberation movements. And the reason why I say that is we've all highlighted, I think, the solidarity that including Mr. Mbeki referred to as well, which is that these former so-called sister liberation movements, which are, in my view, I mean, we are all respectful of the role they played in ushering in independence, as it were. But the key is that this is a changing world, and they have to adapt to that changing world. And that changing world has got values, including in Africa and including Southern Africa, which include democracy and participatory democracy. Now, I cannot see a future of all of those liberation movements throughout Southern Africa if they do not come to terms with understanding that in that shifting world, the demographic that is risen, that is more prevalent, is the young demographic. And that young demographic subscribes to democracy. And in addition to that, even amongst the older generation, even within SADC, there is also a shift in mindset, and embracing democracy and free and fair elections is the go-to place now. And the reason why the SEOM report highlighted all those violations that took place in Zimbabwe is precisely because of that shifting environment. Now, I think that shifting environment is the reason why the current Zimbabwean regime, led by Emmerson Mnangagwa, was caught unawares. It was caught unawares by the shifting sense surrounding that shift in values and perception. Now, the impasse, there is no doubt that the current government in Zimbabwe is illegitimate. Now, the key is its response. It's been caught out in broad daylight, cheating and embarking on a sham election. Now, what you would think is that in terms of the region, we've got the regional powerhouse in SADC, which is South Africa via Ramaphosa. We've seen Ramaphosa going to Ukraine, trying to, which I think is a long shot, by the way, and unrealistic. We have seen him also, I think, offering to mediate in the current flare-up in the Middle East involving Israel and Hamas in Gaza. We saw how the ANC mobilized thousands and thousands of people on the ground in South Africa. And we pose this question that, hang on a minute, we think it's positive, a highly positive development that Ramaphosa is showing such initiative. But these are far-flung places. And you've got on your doorstep a crisis in Zimbabwe, which has lasted several decades without intervening. Now, the question that any reasonable person would pose in that situation is, what is the reason that Mr. Ramaphosa, and including, we've also seen the response by Fikile Balula, the ANC Secretary General, which was shocking and shameful, I would say, what are the reasons why they seem not to be disposed towards finding a lasting solution in Zimbabwe to the impasse? And that's key to the resolution of that impasse. So I would say on one point, regionally, our regional heavyweight, South Africa, has to shift its mindset. And within Zimbabwe itself, within ZANU-PF, we've got a bigger challenge in that the constitution has got term limits. And in terms of the Zimbabwean constitution, we've got ED prime to leave power in 2028. Now, why that's important is that that means that if you go onto the political chessboard, there's a TikTok going on there in terms of the clock, really, the political clock. So each day that we're going past means that there's an immediacy in resolving the impasse before the date for ED to leave power in terms of the constitution comes to fruition. So if you balance that clock, which is ticking in the background, and the reluctance of SADC, including South Africa, the big heavyweight, to address the current Zimbabwean impasse, we are then risking having an implosion in Zimbabwe following the same path that we experienced with the dramatic fall from power of Robert Mugabe. And the reason why I say that is in ZANU-PF, as we speak, we saw recently ED appointing the current CDF, that's Philip Valerius Banda, into the ZANU-PF Politburo. We highlighted that that was unlawful, but nevertheless, it did happen, and eventually the appointment was terminated, and therefore there was an acceptance that it was an illegality. I would highlight that such shenanigans of brazenly breaching the constitution, including appointing a serving commander into the ruling party, is a clear indication that the ruling party, via the current president, is not yet ready to address succession issues in that party. So straight away, you've got another clock ticking in there in terms of the resolution of the same problems that resulted in Robert Mugabe dramatically falling from power. And if you combine that with the reluctance of SADC, Ramaphosa, dilly-dallying, literally avoiding the elephant in the room, which is reaching out to ZANU-PF, making it clear that the election was a sham one, and therefore a political settlement needed. This means that we're simply prolonging the impasse up to a point where it then becomes too late and we risk another implosion, which this time could potentially be very, very chaotic. So these are the challenges that we're currently facing. We've got additional challenges in that rather than seeking to contain the situation, lower the political temperature, the Zimbabwean regime is moved forward to attack the opposition, engage in using a proxy to pretend that proxy is a leader of the opposition, and used that mechanism to trigger MPs, opposition MPs from parliament, and engage in yet another round of elections. I mean, that is clearly irrational and shocking in terms of political choices and craftsmanship at statesman level. So not only do you have the most recent election getting condemned, rather than seeking to address issues that have arisen from the SEOM report and via the SEAC strategy through SADC, you've got a regime that actually, ups the ante and embarks on yet further round of sham elections. I mean, that is incredible in terms of the thinking behind that. And so many people have speculated, obviously, that what informs this culture and this thinking, and where does that lead us in terms of resolving the impasse? And I would say that clearly, the behavior we are witnessing essentially means that, number one, SADC is terrified of dealing with the current Zimbabwean president and the current regime. I mean, clearly, Nevers Mumba and His Excellency President Hichilema of Zambia, were attacked viciously, I would say, by the regime. And I think that would obviously discourage other players within SADC to step up to the fore and try and ensure that this charade is brought to an end. So that's where we are at. And my calculation is that in terms of the Zim's political economy, there is no political commitment, no political will in ZANU-PF, including via the current president, to recognize his own mortality, to work in the national interest, and realize that he is getting on in age. The economy is in the doldrums. Significant chunks of the population have fled Zimbabwe, because of the state of the economy. Generations. I deal here in the UK. I've dealt with waves and waves of Zimbabweans that have moved from Zimbabwe and settled here, and we've got the next sort of young generation we've come via the care work scheme and COSs and the like, and they're struggling. This is not their natural environment and habitat. These are talented young people that can contribute to the country's future. And I think the key is to try and persuade Mr. Mnangagwa and those people that are in his regime to realize that it is not a weakness to seek compromise in the national interest. And much more importantly, Mr. Mnangagwa was had Robert Mugabe as his mentor. They were together for 55 years, if I'm not mistaken, and they fell out. And in the last days, I think that there was no rapprochement. And ultimately, that is a huge lesson. In the end, Mugabe ran out of time. He shrunk in stature, such an icon in Africa to so many people, was humiliated. And he shrunk in stature, and there he was, too little, too late, run out of time, humiliated by his own former protege. And would he have thought that in 1980, in 1990 even, in 2002, after there was another disputed election, or even in 2008, when they subsumed the MDC as a junior partner and did not look at ensuring that the fundamentals would be resolved, which would ensure that Zimbabwe as a nation would thrive into the future rather than short-term parochial interests of power preservation and domination, subjugation of the opposition. I think these are the lessons that we are facing. SADC is to step up, but the chances of that happening clearly do look slim. So unfortunately, unless if the current ZANU-PF leader, Mr. Mnangagwa, realizes that he's getting on, he's running out of time, and that whatever political machinations and calculations he's got in mind, ultimately, it's a long shot in terms of him achieving whatever political ambitions he's got, whether amending the constitution is involved, whether these by-elections mean that if there are any negotiations, he intends to use that as a bargaining chip. I don't know. But whatever his political machinations are, ultimately, we have seen great historical figures falling from power dramatically, including his own mentor. So we just hope that in Zimbabwe's interest, we can only hope at this moment in time, we can only hope that he understands that mortality is there. I'm yet to see any politician that has beaten mortality. I'm yet to see them. They have not yet been born. So that would be my message. And my message would also be to South Africa and the South African presidency that ultimately, and DECO as well, that in terms of international relations and domestic politics, we have seen them kicking up a fuss with the Americans. We've seen them being very active in BRICS. We've seen them very active in relation to the Middle East conflagration and in Ukraine as well. But where are you? Where is your voice when it comes to the Zimbabwean crisis and the Zimbabwean impasse? We're just across, the pond, really, as it were. So it's important that they intervene in time. They don't need to engage in megaphone diplomacy. They can reach the current regime behind the scenes, persuade them to see sense, and ensure that there is a settlement, which also ensures that migration, which is a key issue in South African elections, is resolved at source really in Zimbabwe, because obviously we know the role that that's playing there as well. And that would be my message in short.
Thanks, Brighton. Thanks.
Thank you.
Just one question: what do you expect Zimbabwe should do? Because one of the sentiments in the region when you move around is that, and I think someone made the point, Walton made the point, that everything looks normal in Zimbabwe. Even the recalls, there's no major demonstration against them. Everything looks almost a fait accompli. Why should there be a discussion about post-election as we are doing? What would be your answer to that?
Well, I would accept any criticism that is leveled against the opposition for the failure to engage in demonstrations and raise the political temperature at key points during the development of this crisis. So that criticism is warranted, but I would qualify that criticism by saying that essentially what we have seen in terms of the viciousness of this regime, the use of live ammunition, the use of live ammunition, the protracted, persecution of Job Sikala over 500 days. He was recently acquitted. Persecution directed at judges. So all of that stuff does have a chilling effect on the opposition and its capacity to mobilize and step up to confront the dictatorship. But I would also highlight that taking that into account, we have seen over the years many regimes. It's still needed. That mobilization is still needed to ensure that this continues to be a live issue on SADC's doorsteps. I think that disconnect between the impasse and the regime's continued persecution of the opposition in the current environment does have an impact clearly in terms of SADC's response, because it then becomes difficult for SADC to intervene and persist in highlighting that there is a crisis or an impasse when the opposition is silent and the political temperature is silent, notwithstanding obviously the by-elections that you've referred to, which are clearly bogus and shameless as well. So very difficult, situation.
Right, and before I turn to the floor and ask people to raise their hands to make contributions before we end at 7:30. One question: you're a lawyer and you've been one person who has been studying the situation very closely.
Yes.
And I note that you have been following very closely since all of us discovered the existence of SEOM.
Yes.
And I think there's often a kind of an assumption that SADC has the wherewithal to do what they're supposed to do. I want to argue they don't, and that we, as part of SADC, have to help in guiding SADC and reminding them of the responsibilities. What is your understanding of SEOM?
Well, my understanding of SEOM is that it is a platform that is designed to, achieve peace and ensure that there is conflict resolution. And there is something known as the SEOM strategy, which makes provision for non-state actors within SADC via its protocols to raise a dispute. And via its various protocols, SEOM can provide for, via ministers, via various bodies, for instance, I think I've got it here, section 13.13 of SEOM, and I've also got 7.1.2 of SEOM. There's something called SIPO as well. So in terms of structures via SEOM, there are adequate structures within SEOM, and there is obviously precedent as well of its involvement in Zimbabwe in 2008 and previous involvement in Lesotho as well, in relation to similar situations. And the biggest advantage that I would say SEAC has in that situation is that it's got mediation strategies via the panel of elders, via Council of Foreign Ministers, to act behind the scenes, treat all parties fairly, create a timetable, look at the dispute, look at the recommendations of SEOM, not only in this electoral cycle, but previous cycle as well, look at issues that have not been addressed, via the previous SEOM reports, and ensure that via its strategy and via that platform, it can bring those warring parties behind the scenes using discretion to address all outstanding issues. So for instance, in Zimbabwe's case, it's quite clear that we don't have an independent electoral body. It's quite clear that we've had a sham election, and there is no point in putting in recommendations in the SEOM report for the current regime and the current electoral body to reform when it's clear that the political will isn't there. So what should then happen in that situation is to create a facility via the SEAC strategy. It could be via that panel of elders that we spoke about, the Jacoya Pikwetes, I think Obasanjo and others were previously highlighted, which would then ensure that there could be a national transitional authority which could be brought together. And then when it's brought together via negotiation behind the scenes, it then ensures that it's mandated to create a truly independent electoral body that can then preside over an election at an appropriate time when the political temperature has calmed down to an extent where this is feasible realistically. If that doesn't happen, this cycle of continuing to issue recommendations which are not being complied with is clearly taking us nowhere.
Right, and has a dispute been raised with SEAC? From your knowledge,
my understanding,
people see registered or raised a dispute under the SEAC rules?
My understanding is that there is a dispute that was raised a few weeks ago via that SEAC mechanism. And my understanding as well is that after it was raised, there was resistance from the current regime, the Zimbabwean regime. There was resistance following the raising of that dispute. And at the moment, I don't have any updates as to where that process is at. But the dispute, I'm reliably informed that exists formally, and it's before SADC.
Have you been approached as a lawyer that you are, and as one who has been in this discussion, as to how you could assist SEAC in outlining the rules of engagement on the back of the SEAC statutes?
Informally, I've been approached informally. Yes, I've been approached informally, not formally.
So it's work in progress, huh?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Brighton. Right.
Thank you.
Colleagues, we have a few minutes for, not few, we can go on as necessary, for people to raise their hands to make a contribution before we go back to the panelists to make their final submissions, so to speak, on the way forward. Any hands? Yes, Tony Rila.
Thank you. I think this was an extraordinary discussion. I think Walter Bazembe outlined the great elephant in the room, and it is the fundamentals of the coup. And in the discussion before that, I raised with him the consequences of the Chiweshi judgment and the Malaba curing of the Malaba judgment, of the Chiweshi judgment, and the alteration of our constitution, effectively the amendment of the constitution to raise the issue that the military now have a constitutional right to intervene in civilian affairs if they believe there's a threat to the constitution or the state. And that feeds into, I think, what Walter was talking about, and also into what Moletsi and Becky were saying, that we live in a state of unconstitutionality. Now, this is really fundamental to the current problem, because as the last speaker pointed out, SEAC has a mandate to intervene in post-election conflict. It is quite clear we have post-election conflict, and it's quite clear that we had pre-election conflict vis-a-vis what happened with the coup, the uncured coup. So we now exist in a state, as I understand it, from the interpretation of what happened to those judgments, where we may still be existing in a undeclared state of emergency. So the question gets raised, and this is fundamental to SEAC, what constitutional authority was there for the elections in 2018 and the elections in 2023? Because if those interpretations are right, then we have a major problem in Zimbabwe, and such a major problem that only the suggestion made by Walter Mazembe, and I think discounted by Thabo Mbeki about intervention, but nonetheless pointing out that we exist in a state of large unconstitutionality. And so my question really goes back to the heart of what Walter was saying, was that there is no choice for the country, there's no choice for the region, there's no choice for Africa, and there's no choice for the international community, but to push immediately for a comprehensive political and inclusive settlement to Zimbabwe. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Any other hand? Any other hand? Rusty? Rusty Markham. You're still empty. You're not recalled yet, are you?
Yeah, good evening. Yeah, no. Sorry. I just have a couple of observations. My first thing is, if SADC didn't intervene seriously, or as we say, a little bit too late with the coup, why do we think they'll intervene or do anything of substance today? And I say this on the background of previously we've had shootings in the middle of the capital, and here we are as opposition doing nothing. We haven't put people on the street, we haven't complained, we've gone to parliament, etc. So I have a very cynical view of all that, and going back to what Walter said, I don't believe there is any room for any negotiation with the current regime, for the simple reason is they're not under pressure. They're not under pressure from SADC. They're not under pressure from all the reports. I only asked yesterday in Parliament for them to place a SADC report on the table so we could discuss it, and I was told they can't or they won't. And so we go on. So my biggest issue is this. If you look at us as an opposition, and I include my own party here, and I'm being quite frank, and Walter, I include you guys, and I include everyone, we tend to have a bigger problem trying to solve our opposition problems and each other than we do solving the issue of ZANU-PF. But history will tell us one thing. Never since the written history of this country has anything changed without the direct influence, intervention, or insistence of South Africa, purely because that's our main route of trade. So to think anything, including elections, will change this country, I don't believe so. And I've changed radically in the last few days, purely because I look at what's going on in Parliament, and Parliament has become, it used to be a rubber stamp, but it's now become almost a political party rhetoric which deserves no credit, and it's embarrassing. It really is embarrassing. So I believe, and I do believe, we have a salvation. Our salvation is the age of the people in power. Our biggest salvation is the currently collapsing economy, not only in Zimbabwe. South Africa is starting to face some issues which we were facing 10 years ago. And I look at things like power supply, and I mean they're both fuel and electricity. I'm totally against any GNU for the simple reason is the only time a ruling party comes to talk to you is because they're on the ropes. And I believe we are now in a situation in Zimbabwe where we have no choice other than to crash and burn and start again. Those are my interpretations of today's discussion. I thank you all.
Thanks, Rusty. Very, very frank. Any other hand? Robert, you're very quiet. Robert Chapman. Come to the party.
Thank you, boss. How are you?
Very well yourself.
I'm doing good. Thank you. Doing good. Yes, I'm learning a lot. All protocols observed, all the leaders here. It's been a very fruitful discussion. I think that Dr. Mzembe opened up a can of worms, and I'm still processing that one. You know, there's a part that we go back, we look in the past to understand how we got to where we are. But the big conversation is then how do we move forward? You know, Honorable Rusty brings up a point that I had even shared with a colleague in a message around this discussion, and noting and saying, you know, many things have happened of great, to me, that seem to be more detrimental, more urgent, requiring more urgent attention. And there hasn't been sort of this action-based level of intervention, discussion, call it arm twisting, where people come to the negotiation table. The only time I think we saw this sort of intervention, as Dr. Mzembe made a big point, was in 2008, when the MDC really took action to the ground, to the streets. So there's a part of me, and Honorable Mbeki brought up a very hard note when he said that the ANC in its own battles in South Africa would block sort of this idea of even if Zambia took the forefront. And then we have the issue that Mnangagwa was going to be potentially the head of SADC coming just a few months from now. So there's a real issue here. My question would be, as I'm thinking out loud, and maybe not for this panel, but as we should be thinking, what are the homegrown solutions that go beyond rhetoric and talking that allow us to start putting pressure where it needs to be applied? The shameful part is that those that are in opposition have another battle with these issues of recalls. So, they're essentially fighting four battles. You've got the budget, which came out today, that looks very, very crazy. You've got a lot of issues that need to be done when it comes to reforms across the board of the national development. You've got, and the opposition is also facing issues where members are either being recalled and going to by-elections. So we're not getting out of this mode that allows us to focus on issues. How do we put pressure for those that are, outside sort of this cage match to support the fighters that are inside and provide the resources? I don't know what that answer is. Honorable Brighton brought up some very valid points, but I think there needs to be multiple channels of pressure, and we can't really. I don't think we should really rely on SADC to do that for us. That's just my thoughts. So
end up with some firm recommendation as to what should be done. The way forward. What you're a party leader. You're one in the opposition. What do you say, prima facie, as a contribution to this discussion? What the way forward?
I think that we need to, we're seeing what David Kotot's doing, Mayor Kotot's doing down in Bulawayo, which is fantastic. We're seeing Harare is facing its own challenges where there's now a new set of mayor and deputy mayor. My hometown, Chinhoyi, which I'll be there in just a few days, is getting ready to go through its sort of by-elections. We will not be contesting, I can say that, in my own hometown. But I want to find how we can support the homegrown growth of these cities. I think it's the way we're going to be able to demonstrate that there is change. One of the things that I campaigned on, particularly against opposition where there were strongholds, like my city, Chinoy, was the lack of development of being under opposition for 20 years. I think we have to look at an alliance, not maybe from a political standpoint, but from an economic development, an alliance within opposition that looks at progress where it should be. So if we said, okay, we're going to support, Honorable Markham in his area, how do we pull the opposition and the resources to make sure that he's successful and it demonstrates? Because if we're not winning it regionally, the ballot, social media, you can write the best policies, the best constitutions. We were infiltrated when we had a pretty well outlined party constitution. I think we have to touch people inside their homes. We have to touch them in their schools. We have to influence the hearts and minds of people based on development on the ground. And we have to let people fight the battles inside Parliament and push the, lack of a better word, lobby for these reforms on the backbone of economic development. That's just my thoughts off the top, but I think we can put together a task force or a team that looks at the next 12 to 24 months and where we can make impact on actual development. That's just my thoughts. And I have other ones that I probably don't want to share publicly.
No, we'll bring you back in a fortnight. We now go back to the panelists to wrap up, and see Brighton's hand is up. So Brighton, your final words for this discussion, Brighton.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you for having me. I mean, what I will say as a takeaway is this: there cannot be change without pain. Our country's constitution provides for the right to protest peacefully. That right has always existed. Now, if that right is combined with what's before SADC, there is potential to resolve the crisis via dramatizing the sham election, the charade that we're seeing. And I take on board the fact that what's happened with these by-elections, part of the reason, the strategy that is behind the by-elections, in my view, is also to ensure that the opposition is distracted into division and rancor, which then means that ultimately it becomes weakened and it takes away its focus away from potentially confronting the regime within the constitution peacefully to fighting for survival. But there won't be any solution in Zimbabwe without addressing the elephant in the room, which is peaceful mobilization and bravery to confront the regime, including even on the streets, so that the cost of the decisions that the regime is making and the attitude that is displaying becomes higher. Ultimately, I cannot see any solution outside of that and outside of, SADC having to intervene, being forced to intervene, rather than the current situation where they're having to deal with paperwork, which is not really weighted with, huge political pressure from massive demonstrations, for instance. But I do take on board that the environment is clearly dangerous and it's extremely difficult and trying. But I cannot see a solution outside of that. And if that doesn't happen, I'm quite confident that in terms of the matrix which are seeing politically and economically, then ultimately the end result will be implosion and chaos further down the road. And SADC will then be rueful pertaining to why they did not intervene earlier when they had the chance. And likewise, those that are in power currently, who are behaving as if they were promised immortality, they will also be equally rueful, because if chaos engulfs Zimbabwe, ultimately it means that it will visit their homes as well. And at that point, it will be too late. And so let's not go to the precipice. Let's pull away from the brink, work in the national interest, and ensure that the future of our very beautiful nation is resolved peacefully and in a civilized manner.
Thanks, Brighton. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Prof.
Larry, your last word, Larry?
So, I think, and I've been watching this for a while now, but I think there are three strategies that in terms of the way forward. One is the external pressure from SADC or from others, but I think Brighton's right that that'll only happen once the implosion happens, and the implosion will have very negative consequences on many people living in Zimbabwe, even more so perhaps than now, although it seems pretty dire now. The second is sort of internal grassroots organizing, people going out on the streets, rallies, trying to bring the country in a sense to an internal standstill. And again, that has considerable consequences for the people who do go out on the streets and may face violence or even just detention and other acts like that. And then the third strategy, which is what I was trying to suggest, and I think also is what was mentioned by one of the previous speakers, is to try and create sort of these islands of progress and focus on the local leaders that do exist, that do have control, and make them the demonstration of what a better Zimbabwe can look like. And it's not going to be immediate. There's not going to be an immediate turnaround, and people are going to say, "Oh, great, this is what's happening in Bulawayo. How do we emulate that, tomorrow in Harare or elsewhere?" But I think, that at least there's a strategy that probably requires more discussion of, but how do you really make that work of building on those islands of progress?
Thanks, Larry. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, let's see. Well, let's see, Mzee.
Yeah, I'm back.
Karibu.
Very reluctant to encourage mayhem in Zimbabwe. 10 years ago, we had a big strike by mine workers in the platinum industry in South Africa. And within 45 minutes, the ANC government had killed 34 of them in front of the TV cameras. And at the beginning of the morning, they had commissioned 4 mortuary vans to come to the demonstration. So I think we have to be very cautious about exposing our population to these regimes. These regimes mean business, they are not playing. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, a few years ago, just before the death of Morgan Tsvangirai, we and Morgan, especially myself and Morgan, organized the progressive parties in Eastern and Southern Africa. And we had a conference in Johannesburg of opposition parties from 8 different countries in the region. Unfortunately, we appointed Mmusi Maimane, who was then leader of the Democratic Alliance, to be the chair and convener of that meeting. And Mmusi had his fallout with the white liberals in the Democratic Alliance, and he got demoralized, and that organization fell apart. In my view, I think we have to reopen that chapter of progressive parties in Southern and Eastern Africa. And then we work out a strategy for the way forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Molesi. Thanks very much indeed. And especially for coming on board as a last resort for us. Thank you. Last but not least, Walter Mzembi.
Thank you very much. Let me just say the solution I suggested, which is already playing, I think, of a comprehensive, inclusive national dialogue, means exactly that. It means that we have to onboard everyone, including G40. I'm just making a correction on G40 not being part of the solution. We are actually very intrinsically part of the solution because we are the only ones who understand that beast we are discussing here. So it has to happen at multifaceted levels. in both the opposition and the ruling party. There has to be a new culture of engagement, of dialogue, because change will not come to Zimbabwe before it visits ZANU-PF. Whenever there's been any semblance of change in Zimbabwe, it's because it was occasioned by disruption within ZANU-PF itself. So we are a major player, a major stakeholder. That said, I also want to latch on to what Larry Geber said about the weighting of Zimbabwe in terms of the interest of the international community in its affairs vis-a-vis when it's placed pari passu with other conflicts around the globe. We pale into insignificance when we talk about conflict in terms of the globe's own assessment of priorities. So we are on our own. We are on our own. So if we're on our own on the international community scale, we are also on our own in SADC, in that SADC virtually has divided itself between liberation movements and the liberals, the neoliberals, or as they are called. So there are 6, 7 countries that are collaborating for their own perpetuity and existence. And they call themselves the liberation movements, and rightfully so, that's what they are. And they will protect each other to the net. What
You probably want to. Probably the network.
Seeing a failure for United Papers, and ZANU-PF is exploiting all the way the 2/3 majority.
If you can close your video.
Hello?
Yes, Dr. Walter, if you can close your video so
I
that
see.
you can hear you clearly.
I see. Okay. All right. Okay. So they are exploiting it all the way to their pursuit of a 2/3 majority. I'm afraid we are actually faced with a far more grim situation inside the country right now. The pursuit of a 2/3 majority basically means so the ambition is basically for the incumbent to succeed himself into a 3rd term going forward. In what I read from where I sit, because I probably see now with better clarity seeing this thing from outside inside, I think we are headed for a monarchy. That's as far west prospect, but it's in the horizon, and there are all the telltale signs of it. So the only people who can help us recalibrate this are the constituents that I referred to in the initial submission, the military sector, who initially took sides with a faction inside ZANU-PF for what they termed an Operation Restore Legacy. A conversation has to be opened with that constituency, which leads us to them answering the question on whether this is what they envisaged as the legacy project. Where we are heading to is far much worse, 300%, than what we got rid of in Mugabe. So we need to push that broad national inclusive comprehensive dialogue project at all levels, at partisan level, leading to an integrated solution at national level. And I repeat, statesmen must step forward. We must not tire. Yes, there will be a day maybe when SADC will be convinced by things that perhaps we don't see now that may happen on their own, organically. But we should not expect a solution from SADC at this stage. They are basically protecting each other. We must inculcate and conceive and grow a homegrown solution and reach out to the regime. I thank you.
Thanks very much, Walter. I won't try and summarize the discussion. Safe to say that it will not confronted not only with the specter of disputed election. This has been the history of Zimbabwe for the last 20 years, disputed elections. I think it's more the extent to which our country is broken and has been broken for almost 2 decades. We are not making progress. If we are, it's very, very small compared to the rest of the region. Anybody who moves around the region can realize that we are really behind the rest of the countries in the region. And two, saddled as we are with a large diaspora, in which we have 75%, 75% of all professional skilled Zimbabweans outside the country. And when we have a deterioration in the quality of life, we have cholera, we have mass unemployment, university graduates have no jobs. It's a specter that haunts the rest of the region. But in our case, given the fragility of our economy at the moment, all the indications are that we need to get together, as Walter Mzembe has suggested, into a national dialogue. And as Tony Rila says, a conference. We understand the constraints of SADC. SADC is only as strong as its members want it to be. And we have to help SADC help us. But as everyone has said here, including Rusty Markham, we need to organize ourselves at home first and foremost. And the kind of dialogue that Walter has suggested is something that we have already put on paper. We have formed a national dialogue forum, and we would want to keep that going. And as time goes by, we'll keep you informed of the steps we're taking. And I repeat, it's not about just a disputed election or the perceived impasse, post-election impasse. It's really about getting Zimbabwe out of the doldrums and moving forward as a strong country that it should be. And that we, all of us, including ZANU-PF, including Emerson Mnangagwa, can live up to it and form a national dialogue and towards a kind of transitional authority, which will give us the basis for a better and a more progressive election the second time around.